He had 75,000 men. He had the best army the South ever assembled. He had a plan so precise, so calculated, that his own generals called it a stroke of genius. And in 3 days, it turned into the single worst catastrophe in American military history. The man was Robert E. Lee. The place was Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The year was 1863. And what you are about to hear is not the version they teach in school. This is the real plan, the real decisions, the real moments where everything fell apart. Because the most haunting question of the entire Civil War is not who won. It is this: how did the greatest general in North America walk into a battle with every advantage and lose? If you have never seen this channel before, hit subscribe right now. One click, because what I'm about to show you about Lee's plan, the real plan, nobody has laid it out like this before. And after this video, you will never look at the Civil War the same way again. To understand why Gettysburg broke the way it did, you have to understand what Robert E. Lee felt in the summer of 1863. He didn't feel doubt. He felt invincible. Look at his record. 12 months before Gettysburg, Lee had won battle after battle in ways that made professional military men across Europe stop and stare. At Second Bull Run in August 1862, he shattered a Union army of 62,000 men. He didn't just beat them, he broke them, sent them running. At Fredericksburg in December 1862, Union forces charged uphill into his defenses 12 times. 12. And 12 times, Lee's men cut them down. Over 12,000 Union casualties to fewer than 5,000 Confederate. And then came Chancellorsville in May 1863, the battle that made Lee a legend. His opponent, Joseph Hooker, had 130,000 men. Lee had 60,000. The military textbook said Lee should retreat, regroup, play defense. Lee did the opposite. He split his already outnumbered army, sent Stonewall Jackson on a secret march through thick forest, and hit the Union flank at dusk with such ferocious surprise that Hooker's entire right side collapsed like a house of cards. Hooker didn't lose the battle on the field. He lost it in his own mind. He froze. And Lee won. So when Lee rode into Pennsylvania in June 1863, he wasn't being reckless. He was being himself, a man who had beaten worse odds, on worse ground, against bigger armies, and walked away with victories that should have been impossible. But here's the thing nobody tells you. Chancellorsville was also the beginning of the end. Because on the night of May the 2nd, 1863, while Lee's army was still celebrating its greatest victory, a group of Confederate soldiers fired into the darkness by mistake. And the man who rode back through those shadows was Stonewall Jackson. He was shot 3 times. His left arm was amputated, and 8 days later, he was dead. Lee, when he heard the news, went quiet for a long time. Then he said, "He has lost his left arm, but I have lost my right arm." That sentence tells you everything. Because the man Lee was about to send into Pennsylvania, the plan he was about to execute, it required Stonewall Jackson. It required someone who would take an audacious order and carry it out with speed and aggression and zero hesitation. And Jackson was gone. Tell me something, right now in the comments. If Stonewall Jackson had lived, do you think Lee wins at Gettysburg? I want to see what this community thinks. Drop your answer below. This is the debate that historians have fought over for 160 years. Now let's talk about the plan itself. Because Lee's invasion of Pennsylvania was not a desperate gamble. It was a 3-layer strategic calculation, and every layer made logical sense. Layer 1, feed the army. Virginia had been a battlefield for 2 years. The land was burned, stripped, and exhausted. Lee's men were going hungry. Pennsylvania was untouched farmland, rich, fertile, full of horses and grain and livestock. A march north meant his army could eat and Virginia could recover. Layer 2. Break the North's will to fight. Lee understood something that pure military men often miss. Wars are not won only on battlefields. They are won and lost in the minds of people at home. And the American North in 1863 was not a unified, determined war machine. There was a powerful political faction, the Peace Democrats, who were screaming that this war needed to stop, that the cost was too high, that the dead were too many. If Lee could bring the war to Pennsylvania soil, if newspapers in Philadelphia and New York started printing reports of Confederate armies marching through American towns, the political pressure on Abraham Lincoln might become impossible to resist. Layer 3. Make Europe move. Britain and France were watching this war like gamblers watching a table. They needed Southern cotton for their textile mills. And if the Confederacy proved on Northern soil that it was a permanent and unbeatable nation, European recognition might finally come. Recognition meant loans, weapons, possibly even direct military support. 3 layers: military, political, diplomatic. This was not the plan of a man who had run out of ideas. This was the plan of a man at the absolute razor-sharp peak of his strategic thinking. There was just one assumption, buried underneath all 3 layers. One assumption that everything else depended on. Lee assumed he could find the Army of the Potomac, on ground of his choosing, and destroy it. Not beat it. Not outmaneuver it. Destroy it. End it so completely that the North would have no army left to send against him. That assumption was about to meet reality. Here is something I want to know. Which layer of Lee's plan do you think was the smartest? The military strategy, the political pressure, or the European recognition angle? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you are watching this from outside America, I especially want to hear from you. On June 3, 1863, the Army of Northern Virginia began moving north. 75,000 men. 3 corps. The most formidable Confederate force ever assembled. First Corps belonged to James Longstreet. Big, slow-talking. Lee called him his old war horse. Longstreet was a defensive genius, a man who understood that the math of attacking fortified positions in the age of rifled muskets almost never worked in the attacker's favor. He had reservations about this entire invasion. He voiced them. Lee listened politely and then ignored him. Second Corps belonged to Richard Ewell, newly promoted after Stonewall Jackson's death. Ewell was brave. He was competent. But he was not Jackson. And at the moment when Lee needed someone to think like Jackson, to move like Jackson, to strike like Jackson, that difference would cost everything. Third Corps belonged to Ambrose Powell Hill. Aggressive. Prone to illness at the worst possible times. And then there was Jeb Stuart. Stuart commanded Lee's cavalry. The eyes of the army, the intelligence network, the early warning system. Without Stuart, Lee was riding blind into enemy territory. And on June 25, 1863, Jeb Stuart decided to go for a ride. Stuart took 3 of his 5 cavalry brigades and launched what he called a raid around the Union Army. His official purpose was to harass federal supply lines. His real purpose, historians have argued for 160 years, was his own reputation. 6 days earlier, at a place called Brandy Station, Union cavalry had surprised Stuart's men and fought them nearly to a standstill. It was the largest cavalry battle ever fought on American soil. And for Jeb Stuart, a man who wore a plumed hat and needed glory the way other men need water, Being fought to a draw by Union horsemen was humiliating. He needed a headline. He needed a dramatic exploit. He needed everyone to forget Brandy Station. So he rode, and he was gone for 8 days. 8 days, during which Lee had no reliable intelligence about Union movements whatsoever. 8 days, during which the Army of the Potomac was closing in, faster than Lee knew, harder than Lee could prepare for. On June 28th, Lee finally got information. Not from Stuart. From a spy, a shadowy figure known only as Harrison, who rode into Confederate headquarters and told Lee something that made the blood drain from the room. The Army of the Potomac had already crossed the river. It was in Maryland. It was moving north, and it had a new commander, George Gordon Meade, a Pennsylvanian, a fighter, a man who would defend his home state with everything he had. Lee immediately ordered his scattered forces to concentrate. The careful, calculated invasion plan dissolved overnight into something far more desperate and far more dangerous. He needed his 3 corps together before Meade could destroy them one at a time. The roads converging across southern Pennsylvania all pointed to the same place. A small crossroads town. 7 roads meeting at a single point. Gettysburg. Neither man chose it. The roads chose it for them. Subscribe right now. I am serious. Because what happens next is the most consequential 72 hours in American military history. And I am going to walk you through every hour of it. Hit that button. You do not want to find out later that you missed this channel. July 1st, 1863. It began as an accident. Confederate infantry marching east along the Chambersburg Pike ran into Union cavalry west of Gettysburg. The cavalrymen, under John Buford, dismounted and fought a desperate delaying action, buying time for Union infantry to arrive. What should have been a skirmish became a battle. By mid-morning, 2 full Union corps were engaged. By mid-afternoon, Confederate forces were attacking from the north and the west simultaneously. The Union line buckled, then it broke. Union soldiers streamed in panic through the streets of Gettysburg itself, Confederate troops chasing them through the town square, down alleys, past the courthouse, past houses where terrified civilians locked their doors and prayed. The survivors ran south, and they ran to high ground. Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, and a long, gentle ridge called Cemetery Ridge. Lee, watching from Seminary Ridge to the west, saw it immediately. Those heights. If the Union Army fortified those heights overnight, if they dug in on that ridge, if they put their artillery on those hilltops, taking them would cost everything. But right now, in this moment, at 5:30 in the afternoon, the Union survivors on those hills were disorganized, exhausted, terrified, streaming in from the roads. They were vulnerable. Attack now, and those heights fall tonight. Wait until morning, and they never fall. At all. Lee sent a message to Richard Ewell. Attack Cemetery Hill, if practicable. If practicable. Two words that historians have argued over for 160 years. Ewell read the message. He surveyed the ground. He consulted his generals. He looked at his tired troops. He looked at the hill. He thought about Jackson. He thought about how Jackson would never have waited, never have deliberated, never have used the word practicable as a reason not to move. And then Ewell decided not to attack. Night fell over Gettysburg. And through that night, the Army of the Potomac dug in on those heights. By morning, George Meade himself had arrived, walked the ground, and made his decision. He would fight here. He would hold Cemetery Ridge. The window had closed. Forever. I need you to answer this right now, in the comments. Who do you blame for the failure on day 1? Lee, for giving a vague order? Ewell, for not attacking? Or is this just what happens when you try to replace an irreplaceable man? Write your answer below, because this single decision, this one afternoon, may have cost the Confederacy the entire war. July 2nd, 1863. Lee's plan for the second day was, in theory, brilliant. Longstreet's First Corps would attack the southern end of Cemetery Ridge, the Union left flank. If that flank collapsed, Confederate troops would get behind the entire Union line, and the position would become untenable. Simultaneously, Ewell would strike the Union right at Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill, keeping Meade's reserves pinned and unable to reinforce either end. Hit both flanks at the same time. Stretch the Union line to breaking. It was the same philosophy that had won at Chancellorsville. There was one condition. Longstreet had to attack early. By mid-morning at the latest, before the Union left flank had time to solidify, Longstreet did not want to attack at all. The conversation between Lee and Longstreet on the morning of July 2nd was not shouted. It was not dramatic. It was something worse. It was two men who respected each other deeply, who had fought side by side for 2 years, speaking to each other across an unbridgeable gulf. Longstreet's argument was simple. Don't attack this position. Move the Confederate Army around the Union left flank instead. Get between Meade and Washington. Find good ground. Make the Union Army come to us and attack us. Let them bleed against Confederate defenses the way Union men bled at Fredericksburg. It was, in retrospect, probably the right answer. Lee said no. The enemy is there, he told Longstreet, pointing toward Cemetery Ridge, and I am going to attack him there. That sentence is the key to the entire battle, not as a tactical statement, as a psychological one. Lee had beaten the odds so many times that he had stopped believing they applied to him. He had split his army against a superior enemy and won. He had attacked uphill and won. He had won by doing the thing that every textbook said was impossible. So when the textbook said don't attack Cemetery Ridge, Lee's instinct said the textbook is wrong again. Longstreet obeyed, and he moved slowly. Whether the delay was deliberate foot-dragging by a general who believed the attack was doomed or unavoidable logistics, a march that had to be rerouted to avoid Union observation, troops needing positioning, artillery needing placement, historians have never agreed. What is not disputed is this. By the time Longstreet's assault stepped off, it was past 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Hours later than Lee intended. Hours in which Union engineers had fortified the exact ground Longstreet was about to attack. When the assault finally hit, it was ferocious. John Bell Hood's division tore through a nightmare landscape of boulders and broken ground called the Devil's Den. They fought uphill through a forest that gave no cover and perfect fields of fire to the defenders above. Hood was wounded badly in the first hour, his left arm destroyed, command passing to others mid-assault. At the far southern end of the Union line, on a rocky hill called Little Round Top, one of the most extraordinary moments in American military history was about to happen. The 20th Maine Infantry Regiment, 358 men, commanded by a man who had been a college professor of rhetoric 18 months earlier, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. They held the extreme left flank of the entire Union Army. There was nothing to their left. If they broke, if they gave ground, the Confederate forces sweeping up the slope would get behind Cemetery Ridge, and the battle was over. The 15th Alabama Regiment charged them, again and again and again. The 20th Maine held, and held, and held. And then they ran out of ammunition. Chamberlain looked at his men. He looked at the slope below him. He looked at another Confederate charge forming at the bottom. He had no bullets. He had no reinforcements. He had bayonets. He gave the order, fix bayonets. And then he ordered his regiment to charge downhill into the enemy. It was so unexpected, so physically audacious, so against every instinct of self-preservation, that the Alabama troops broke. Over 400 were captured, Little Round Top held. But north of there, through the peach orchard and the wheat field, the fighting went on for hours. Both sides threw men into the meat grinder. When night finally fell, the Confederate assault had gained some ground but had not broken the Union line. Ewell's attack in the north was uncoordinated, delayed, and ultimately ineffective. Day 2 was over. Lee had failed again. And he still refused to leave. Out of ammunition. Outnumbered. And he charged downhill with bayonets. That is a decision made in 1 second that changed the entire course of the battle. Tell me in the comments, what do you think went through Chamberlain's mind in that moment? What does a man feel when he gives an order like that? I want to read your answers. July 3rd, 1863. Lee's reasoning for the third day was cold and logical, and in a different war, it would have been correct. He had struck both flanks of the Union position on July 2nd. Meade had been forced to pull troops from the center of his line to defend those flanks, which meant the center, Cemetery Ridge, the long straight middle of the Union fishhook position, had been weakened. It was the place Meade could reinforce least quickly, because it was farthest from both ends. Hit the center, with everything, all at once, and the Union army splits in two. To prepare that assault, Lee planned the largest artillery bombardment ever attempted in the Western Hemisphere. 170 Confederate cannon positioned along Seminary Ridge. They would fire for 1 to 2 hours. They would destroy the Union artillery on Cemetery Ridge. They would shatter the Union infantry behind those stone walls. They would leave the ground smoking and the defenders broken. And then, 12,500 Confederate soldiers would step forward, cross that open field, and finish it. The assault would be led by 3 divisions. At its heart, George Pickett's fresh Virginia Division, 4,500 men who had not yet fought at Gettysburg, rested, ready. Longstreet was told to command the attack. Longstreet, who believed this assault was going to fail before it started, was told to send his men across that field. He would later write that he could not speak the order. He simply nodded. At 1:07 in the afternoon on July 3, 1863, the Confederate artillery opened fire. The sound was heard in Pittsburgh, 150 miles away. The ground shook. Horses screamed. The air above Cemetery Ridge turned black with smoke. Union artillery fired back. For nearly 2 hours, the two sides hammered each other with cannon in the largest artillery duel ever fought on American soil. And then the Confederate guns went quiet. The silence lasted a few seconds, maybe 10. And then the tree line on Seminary Ridge opened. 12,000 men stepped out into the open. They dressed their lines. They straightened their flags. Officers rode to their positions. And they began to walk 1 mile across open farmland into the guns of the Army of the Potomac. What those men felt in that moment, nobody who was not there can fully know. Some of them prayed. Some of them sang. Some of them fixed their eyes on a small cluster of trees at the top of Cemetery Ridge, a place called the Angle, and they walked toward it like men walking toward a door they had been told to open. The Confederate bombardment had failed. The gunners had been firing at targets on the reverse slope of Cemetery Ridge, hidden from view. The fuses were cutting imprecisely. Smoke obscured observation. The shelling had passed over the Union infantry and hit supply wagons and reserve units far behind the line. The Union defenders were shaken, but they were not broken. And when the Confederate infantry stepped into the open, Union General Henry Hunt's artillery reopened fire. From Little Round Top, on the south, From Cemetery Hill on the north, guns fired into the flanks of the advancing Confederate lines. Not into the front, into the sides. Enfilading fire, the deadliest kind, where every round passes down the length of a formation and tears through man after man after man. The Confederate lines started to come apart. Gaps appeared. Men stepped into the gaps, and they kept walking. At 500 yards, the Union infantry opened up with rifles. At 250 yards, the fire became something that survivors would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe, and never quite could. One veteran wrote simply, "The men were mowed down like hay." And still they came. A small number of Confederate soldiers, historians believe 300 to 400 men, actually crossed the stone wall at the angle. They fought hand to hand with Union defenders for a few terrible minutes. Leading them was Lewis Armistead, Brigadier General. He put his black hat on the tip of his sword so his men could follow him in the smoke and chaos. He walked through the fire. He climbed over the stone wall. He put his hand on a Union cannon. And then the Union reserves hit from 3 directions at once. Armistead fell. The breach closed. The assault collapsed. Men streamed back across the field in broken groups, some running, some walking slowly, too exhausted to run, too numb to care, many falling before they reached the Confederate lines. When George Pickett rode back to Robert E. Lee and was asked to reform his division for a possible counterattack, he gave an answer that has been repeated in every book about this battle ever since. "General Lee, I have no division." The charge had lasted less than an hour. 7,000 Confederate casualties in under 60 minutes. 3 of Pickett's brigade commanders were dead or dying. The assault had gained nothing. Lee rode out to meet the survivors. He rode among them slowly. He spoke to them. He touched them. And over and over and over again, to every man who would listen, he said the same thing. "It is all my fault. It is all my fault." 7,000 men in under 1 hour. And Lee said, "It is all my fault." I want to ask you something personal. Has a leader you trusted ever made a decision that cost the people around them everything? You don't have to name names. Just tell me how that felt. Drop it in the comments. Because what Lee experienced in that moment is something every human being understands. Now here is what I want you to really understand. Because most people look at Gettysburg and say, it was Longstreet's fault for moving slowly, or Ewell's fault for not attacking on day 1, or Stuart's fault for leaving the army blind. And all of those things are true, but they are not the full answer. The full answer is harder and more interesting. Lee's plan failed because it was built on a version of war that no longer existed. Think about when Lee learned to fight. He studied war in a world of smoothbore muskets accurate to 80 yards. In that world, attacking armies could close the distance quickly, take some losses, get in among the defenders, and decide the battle with bayonets and courage. Frontal attacks were brutal, but viable. By 1863, almost every soldier on both sides carried a rifled musket accurate to 300 yards. That one change, from smoothbore to rifled, had completely rewritten the mathematics of assault. An attacker crossing open ground now faced accurate fire for a distance 3 times longer than before. The defensive advantage had multiplied enormously. Longstreet understood this. He had been saying it for months. The war had changed. The South's best strategy was to use the defensive advantages that new technology gave them, find strong ground, and make the North bleed attacking it. Lee heard this argument. He understood it intellectually. But he could not make himself believe it in his bones. because every instinct he had was forged in a different kind of war. And there was something else. Lee had beaten the odds so many times that the odds had stopped feeling real to him. When you win at Second Bull Run, and at Fredericksburg, and at Chancellorsville, all against bigger armies, all on harder ground, all in situations where the math said you should lose, you start to develop a kind of faith. Faith in your own army. Faith in your own judgment. Faith that something in you can see possibilities that other men cannot. That faith is what makes a great general great. And it is exactly what makes a great general dangerous. Because there comes a moment in every brilliant career when the faith tips over into something else. When confidence becomes certainty. When certainty becomes something that looks from the outside like recklessness. Napoleon felt it at Waterloo. Rommel felt it at El Alamein. And Robert E. Lee felt it at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, on 3 days in July 1863. Here's the deepest question in this entire story. Is the same quality that makes someone a genius the thing that eventually destroys them? Lee's confidence won him Chancellorsville. The same confidence lost him Gettysburg. Have you ever seen this in your own life? Someone so used to winning that they stopped being able to see when the situation had changed? Tell me in the comments. This is what history is really about. July 4th, 1863, Independence Day. Lee sat in his lines on Seminary Ridge all day, waiting for a Union counterattack that never came. Meade, exhausted and cautious, chose not to pursue. That night, in driving rain, the Confederate army began to withdraw. The supply wagon train of Confederate wounded stretched 17 miles down the road toward Virginia. 17 miles. Of men who were screaming, or silent, or praying, or already gone. The total cost of 3 days at Gettysburg, more than 50,000 men, on both sides, killed, wounded, or missing. The Union lost approximately 23,000. The Confederacy lost somewhere between 23 and 28,000, possibly a third of Lee's entire army. And on that same July 4th, 1,200 miles to the southwest, the Confederate garrison at Vicksburg, Mississippi, surrendered to Ulysses Grant after a 47-day siege. The Mississippi River, the spine of the Confederacy, now belonged to the Union. The South had been cut in two. Both disasters on the same day. In London and Paris, the news arrived and was absorbed quietly. The conversations about formally recognizing Confederate independence, conversations that had been going on for months in diplomatic circles, stopped. Not officially, not dramatically. They simply stopped. The door that Lee had marched north to open had been sealed shut. Lee wrote to Jefferson Davis and asked to be removed from command. He wrote, "The general remedy for the want of success in a military commander is his removal. I therefore, in all sincerity, request your excellency to take measures to supply my place." Davis refused. There was no one else. Lee would fight on for nearly 2 more years. He would fight brilliantly, defensively, making Grant pay in blood for every mile of Virginia. He would hold the line longer than anyone had a right to expect. But he would never again be the man who rode into Pennsylvania in June of 1863, filled with the certainty of victory. That man had been left behind on a Pennsylvania ridge. In November 1863, Abraham Lincoln came to Gettysburg to dedicate a cemetery for the Union dead. The main speaker that day talked for 2 hours. Lincoln spoke for 2 minutes. He wrote his remarks on whatever paper was available. Some accounts say on an envelope on the train from Washington. 271 words. He did not simply honor the dead. He redefined the entire war. He said that this nation was being tested to see whether any nation built on the idea that all men are created equal could survive. He said the dead had already consecrated this ground. Nothing he could say would add to or subtract from what they had done here. He said the living must dedicate themselves to the unfinished work. 271 words, written, some say, on an envelope, still recited by school children 160 years later. The field is quiet now. The wheat comes back every year. The peach trees have been replanted. The stone wall at the angle still stands, worn smooth by the hands of 10 million people who came to touch it and try to understand. There are 1,328 monuments at Gettysburg, more than on any other battlefield in the world. Every regiment, every battery, every unit that fought there, marked in stone. The names are so numerous that if you tried to read everyone, it would take you most of a day. Walk up to the stone wall at the angle, put your hand on it. Somewhere on the other side of that wall, Lewis Armistead put his hand on a Union cannon and fell. Somewhere behind you, across that long open field, 12,000 men walked out of a tree line and kept walking when everything in the human body said stop. And somewhere on Seminary Ridge, Robert E. Lee watched them go and knew, somewhere in the part of a great man that is still just a man, that he had asked too much. 3 days, 50,000 casualties, one plan, one failure, and a nation that would spend the next 160 years trying to understand what it meant. It is all my fault. The words of a great man. At the moment, he finally understood his limits. If this story moved you the way it moves me every time I go back to the research, subscribe right now. This channel exists for people who want history told like this. Like it actually mattered, like the people in it were real. Hit the button, hit the bell, because next week we go just as deep into another story that changed everything. I have one last question for you, and I want you to really think about it before you answer. Which moment in this story hit you the hardest? Was it Lee saying, "I have lost my right arm," after Jackson died? Was it Chamberlain ordering that bayonet charge with no ammunition left? Was it Armistead with his hand on the Union cannon? Or was it Lee riding out to meet the survivors and saying, "It is all my fault"? Drop your answer below and tell me why. Because the reason that moment hits you says something real about who you are.